When you reach 92, you stop pretending the world is gentle. People think age brings peace. That time sands down the sharp edges. That secrets grow lighter when you're old enough to forget them. They're still wrong. Some truths don't fade. They ferment. They sit quietly inside you for decades, growing heavier each year, until one day you realize the weight was never the burden. The danger was letting them be known. I've lived long enough to watch strong men unravel from a single sentence, to see families fracture over a truth that arrived too late to fix anything, to understand that honesty, when poorly timed, can be more destructive than any lie. There are things you should never tell anyone. Not your closest friend, not your spouse of 50 years, not even the people who swear they die for you, especially them. At 92, you stop counting birthdays. You start counting moments you wish you could pull back into your chest and bury deeper. Moments when you spoke, and something precious never recovered. I remember the first time I learned this lesson. It was subtle. No shouting, no violence, just a quiet shift in the air, like a room losing oxygen. I told the truth because I believed it would set me free. Instead, it set something else loose. People love to say, if they can handle the truth, that sits their problem. That sits what the young believe. The unbroken, the ones who haven't yet watched a single sentence echo for decades. Because the truth doesn't disappear once spoken. It mutates. It gets repeated with different tones, different intentions, different endings. And soon, it sits no longer yours. At my age, you realize something terrifying. Some knowledge isn't meant to connect people. It isolates them. I've seen secrets ruin marriages without anyone cheating, end friendships without betrayal, turn love into suspicion, simply by existing in the open. Not because the secret was evil, but because the human mind is. We imagine others will receive our truth the way we experience it, carefully, thoughtfully, with context and restraint. They hear it through fear, through ego, through their own unresolved wounds. And once it's heard, you can explain it back into silence. That fits the cruel trick of honesty. It feels noble. It feels brave. Until you realize bravery isn't always wisdom. I've buried friends who told the wrong truth to the wrong person at the wrong time. Not physically buried, but emotionally erased. People stopped calling, stopped trusting, stopped seeing them the same way ever again. All because of words they thought needed to be said. By 92, you understand this. Some truths are not confessions. They are weapons. And once released, they don't choose who they wound. There are 6 things I learned far too late that should never be spoken aloud. 6 truths that cost more than they gave. 6 moments I would silence, if time allowed mercy. But before I tell you what they are, you need to understand why silence once felt so safe, and why breaking it was the first crack in everything. Because the danger didn't arrive loudly. It whispered, and I listened. What felt like safety was already preparing to betray me. Before the cracks, there is always comfort. I remember a time when everything felt firmly in place. My name meant something. My word carried weight. People listened when I spoke, and more importantly, they trusted why I spoke. That trust felt permanent. It's as easy to confuse familiarity with safety. Easy to believe that, because nothing has gone wrong yet, nothing ever will. That sips the lie we live inside. Back then, secrets felt harmless. Not dangerous, just unnecessary to share. I told myself they were mine to keep. That silence wasn't deception. It was protection. Protection for others. Protection for myself. Psychologists have a word for this illusion. They call it emotional homeostasis. The belief that our inner world will remain stable if we don't disturb it. As long as we don't shake the table, nothing will fall. History is filled with people who believed the same thing. Civilizations that mistook quiet for strength. Families who thought love alone could absorb any truth. They didn't collapse in chaos. They drifted when everything feels safe. Warnings sound dramatic, exaggerated, almost insulting. Why prepare for a storm when the sky is blue? I was surrounded by people who loved me. At least, I thought they did. Meals were shared. Laughter came easily. Old stories were told again and again. Each time softer, each time more polished. No one asked the questions that mattered, and I didn't volunteer the answers. That's how the illusion strengthens. When both sides agree not to look too closely. I believed silence was neutral, that withholding certain truths didn't change reality. It merely delayed discomfort. But silence isn't empty. It stays crowded. It fills with assumptions, with interpretations, with stories people tell themselves in the absence of facts. And those stories are rarely kind. Still, I felt untouchable. I had survived wars, loss, economic ruin, buried friends, siblings, entire chapters of my life. What could words possibly do that time hadn't already tried? This was the arrogance of experience. The belief that because you've endured pain, you understand it completely. You don't instead. I told myself that honesty was a tool I could control, that I could decide when and how much truth to release, as if truth were a valve, as if people would hear only what I intended. Looking back now, that belief feels almost innocent, dangerously so, because the moment you decide you stir in control, you stop watching for warning signs. You stop noticing the tension behind smiles, the hesitation before certain questions, the way silence lingers just a second longer than it should. There was a moment, small, forgettable at the time, when someone asked me something simple, not invasive, not aggressive, just curious. I remember thinking, they sip are ready now. I remember feeling relief, like I was finally allowed to exhale. That feeling, that urge to unburden yourself, to finally be seen, is just the most dangerous emotion of all. Because safety doesn't disappear all at once. It fractures quietly, and the first crack always feels like honesty. I answered them, not fully, not recklessly, just enough. And the room changed. Not visibly, not immediately, but something shifted, and it never shifted back. That was the first warning sign, and I ignored it, because I still believed I was safe. I didn't realize the truth had already begun to move on its own. The first damage never announces itself. There's no confrontation, no slammed doors, no raised voices demanding answers. Just distance. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that people were tired, distracted, busy with their own lives. That's how the mind protects itself, by offering reasonable explanations for unreasonable changes. Conversations grew shorter. Eyes lingered a moment too long before looking away. Questions stopped altogether, replaced by polite nods and careful pauses. Nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different. This is the danger of partial truth. It doesn't explode. It seeps. It creates space where closeness once lived. I noticed people filling in gaps I never meant to leave, drawing conclusions I never offered, reacting not to what I said, but to what they feared it implied. Humans don't just hear facts. They hear meaning, and meaning is shaped by insecurity. I wanted to correct them, to clarify, to say that's not what I meant. But once a truth is spoken, it becomes slippery. Each attempt to explain only adds another layer for others to interpret. So I stayed quiet again. And that was when suspicion began to grow. Silence after honesty doesn't feel like protection. It feels like concealment. People start wondering what else you haven't said, what else you might be hiding, even if there's nothing more at all. I watched trust erode without a single accusation being made. Smiles remained. Manners stayed intact, but warmth vanished. It's terrifying how fast people adjust to emotional absence. How quickly they accept a colder version of someone they once loved. I remember sitting across from someone I cared deeply about, someone who used to finish my sentences, and realizing they were listening differently now, not to understand, but to evaluate. Every word weighed, every pause measured, as if I had become a risk. That sits when fear entered the room. Not theirs. Mine. I began rehearsing sentences before speaking, avoiding certain memories, editing myself in real time, all because of one truth spoken too soon, or too late, or simply to the wrong ears. I told myself it would pass. That time would smooth it over. That familiarity would restore what honesty disrupted. Time doesn't yet do that. Time doesn't yet heal fractures caused by perception. It hardens them. People had already rewritten who I was in their minds, and no amount of explanation could reclaim the old version. That's when I noticed it wasn't just one relationship changing. Others were shifting too, subtly, quietly, like dominoes moving before they fall. I had mistaken the first crack for harmless honesty. But cracks spread, and once they do, they follow paths you consider control. I still believed I could stop it, but the damage had already learned how to grow. There's a moment when you realize the problem is no longer private. It escapes the space between two people and enters the room, the family, the group, the shared history. And once others feel it, they begin to protect themselves. I could sense it in the way conversations stopped when I entered. Not abruptly, nothing so obvious. Just a soft tapering off, a change in subject, a careful smile that arrived half a second too late. That steps when denial becomes tempting. I told myself I was being paranoid. That age had made me sensitive, that I was reading meaning into nothing. Denial isn't ignorance. It's self-preservation. The people around me had their own version of it. They justified the distance, explained away the tension. He didn't mean it like that. She sits just overthinking. It's not a big deal. Those sentences are anesthesia. They dull the pain just enough to avoid action. But problems don't need attention to grow. They only need permission. I watched loved ones quietly recalibrate. How close they stood to me. Emotionally, not physically. Trust became conditional. Affection became careful. As if I had crossed an invisible line. No one had warned me existed. What hurt most wasn't rejection. It was restraint. People began protecting themselves from me, not because I was cruel, not because I was dishonest, but because I had revealed something that disrupted the story they were comfortable believing. Humans defend narratives the way nations defend borders. Anything that threatens stability is labeled dangerous, even if it's true. I tried to restore balance, to smooth things over with kindness, with humor, with silence. But silence now felt strategic, suspicious. Once doubt enters a relationship, neutrality disappears. Everything is reinterpreted. A pause becomes avoidance. A joke becomes deflection. A boundary becomes guilt. I felt myself shrinking, choosing words more carefully, offering less of myself, not because I wanted to hide, but because exposure had become expensive. And still, I refused to believe it was irreversible. I told myself, this will pass. People will forget. Love is stronger than discomfort. That's what we say when the truth is too heavy to accept. But one evening, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable, someone I trusted looked at me differently. Not with anger, with calculation. That look said everything words hadn't. It said I'm reevaluating you. In that moment, I understood something too late. The problem was what I said. It was that I had changed the way I was seen. And once that happens, no apology can undo it. I went to sleep that night believing I could still fix it, believing I had time. I was wrong, because the next choice I made would seal what honesty had already set in motion. There is always a moment, quiet, unmarked, almost merciful, when everything could still be saved. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't arrive with urgency. It feels ordinary. That fits why so many people miss it. I remember sitting alone, replaying every conversation in my mind, every word I had shared, every silence that followed. I knew something was wrong. Not vaguely, not intuitively. I knew there was still time to stop talking, to pull back, to let the truth remain incomplete. Silence could still contain the damage. Instead, I tried to fix it. That's where regret is born. I thought clarity would restore trust, that explaining myself fully would erase misunderstanding. This is the mistake people make when they believe truth behaves logically. It doesn't. Truth behaves emotionally, and emotion doesn't want resolution, it wants confirmation. So I spoke again. Not dramatically, not impulsively. Carefully, reasonably. I told myself I was choosing courage over fear. But courage without wisdom is just exposure. I revealed more. Not everything. Just enough to complete the picture. That phrase still haunts me. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt it. That internal drop. That quiet collapse of something you didn't realize was holding you up. The listener didn't interrupt, didn't react. They simply absorbed it. And in their silence, I understood. The truth had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a personal confession. It was information. Information can be shared, repeated, reframed. And once that happens, intent no longer matters. I could see the shift in their eyes, the mental reorganization. They weren't hearing me anymore. They were recalculating everything they thought they knew. That was the point of no return. Not because the truth was unforgivable, but because it was unforgettable. Later, alone again, I tried to convince myself it was necessary. That honesty demanded sacrifice. That discomfort was the price of authenticity. Those are comforting lies we tell ourselves. After the damage is done, the reality is simpler. Some truths don't free you. They exile you. From then on, I was no longer just a person in their life. I was a question mark, a liability, a story they would now tell themselves when I wasn't in the room. And stories, once formed, are almost impossible to revise. I went to bed that night knowing something irreversible had happened. Not loudly, not violently, just permanently. I had spoken the truth one time too many. And what followed wasn't that confrontation. It was collapse. Collapse doesn't look like disaster. It looks like confusion, like unanswered messages, like invitations that stop arriving without explanation. It looks like being slowly edited out of other people's lives. No one confronted me. No one demanded explanations or closure. They did need to. They had already decided what my truth meant. That's the cruel efficiency of quiet consequences. There turns nothing to argue against. No accusation to defend yourself from, just absence. I noticed it in small things first. A phone call that never came back. A visit postponed indefinitely. A tone that turned polite, then distant, then hollow. People weren't angry. They were cautious. Fear doesn't shout. It withdraws. I began to feel like an artifact, something fragile, possibly dangerous, best handled carefully or not at all. They spoke around me now, never to me. I could sense the internal negotiations happening behind their eyes. How much can we share? What's safe to say? What might he reveal next? That's when loneliness takes a new shape. That's not being alone in a room. It's being present, and no longer included. I tried to accept it with dignity. Told myself this was the cost of honesty. That integrity required isolation. That was another lie. Integrity didn't just ask for this. Impatience did. The worst part wasn't losing people. It was realizing they hadn't left suddenly. They had been leaving slowly, step by careful step, Ever since the first truth escaped my mouth, I replayed everything endlessly, not to punish myself, but to understand where control had slipped away. It always led back to the same moment. Not when I spoke, but when I continued speaking. Collapse isn't dramatic. It is just administrative. People adjust boundaries, change expectations, lower emotional investment, until one day, there stands nothing left to collapse. I woke up one morning and realized something terrifying. No one needed me to explain anymore. They had moved on. That fits when silence becomes unbearable, because now it isn't chosen. It's assigned. I sat with that silence for a long time, listening to it echo through memories, through faces that once felt familiar. And in that quiet, a truth finally surfaced. One I wished I had learned decades earlier. Not all consequences arrive as punishment. Some arrive as emptiness. And emptiness doesn't stand, it just expands. What remained after the collapse was worse than loss. It was understanding. After everything falls quiet, something else begins to speak. It isn't anger. It isn't grief. It's as clarity. Clarity arrives late. It waits until there sits nothing left to protect. When relationships are already altered, when words can no longer undo what they have done. I spent a long time sitting with memories, not the loud ones, but the small, overlooked moments where restraint could have changed everything. Times when silence would have been mercy. Was taught that truth is moral, that withholding is cowardice, that honesty is always the higher ground. Those are lessons taught by people who haven't watched honesty hollow out their lives. At 92, you learn something darker. Truth is not virtue. Wisdom is. Wisdom knows timing, audience, consequence. Truth alone knows none of these. I realized the mistake wasn't set having secrets. It was misunderstanding their purpose. Some secrets aren't set shameful. They set stabilizing. They hold fragile systems together. Families, friendships, identities that cannot survive certain knowledge. We assume people want the truth. What they want is safety. When truth threatens safety, people don't rise to meet it. They retreat. I don't blame them anymore. Fear makes cowards of everyone, including me. The years taught me something painfully specific. There are truths that ask to be spoken, and truths that ask to be carried. Knowing the difference is the difference between connection and isolation. I carried the wrong ones too lightly, gave them away thinking I was unburdening myself. I didn't realize I was handing others something they couldn't hold. Now, when I look back, I don't see villains. I see overwhelmed people protecting their inner worlds, the only way they knew how, by stepping away from mine. That understanding doesn't heal the loss, but it softens the regret, because regret changes shape with age. It stops screaming. It starts whispering. It whispers, "You should have known better. You should have waited. You should have said less." At 92, the past doesn't haunt you. It instructs you, and the lesson is heavier than any confession. Silence is not always fear. Sometimes it's love. I wish I had understood that earlier, because once you understand it this late, there's no one left to practice it with. And that's when the final warning becomes impossible to ignore. If you are still listening to this, you still have time. Time to choose which truths deserve a voice, and which ones deserve a burden bearer. Because not everything that is true needs to be shared. I know that goes against what you have been told. You've been taught that openness is courage, that transparency is strength, that silence is suspicion. Those ideas are comforting. They are also incomplete. At 92, I've learned that words are irreversible events. Once released, they don't belong to you. They belong to the fears of the people who hear them. Ask yourself this, not is it true, but what will this truth cost? And more importantly, who will pay the price? Some truths don't damage because they are cruel. They damage because they arrive without context, without timing, without the strength to carry them. If you must speak, choose carefully. Not everyone who loves you is equipped to know everything about you. That doesn't make them dishonest. It makes them human. I once believed that being fully known was the same as being fully loved. It isn't that. Love often survives because of what we choose not to say. At my age, I don't fear death. I fear unnecessary honesty. The kind that fractures instead of frees. If there's one thing I would leave behind, one warning etched into whatever time you have left, it's this: some truths don't need witnesses. They need wisdom, and wisdom almost always speaks last.